The air in Minneapolis was cold on January 7, 2026. It was a familiar cold, a biting wind that whips through the city streets every winter. But this day, the cold held a different kind of chill. It was the cold of steel, the cold of a bullet tearing through glass. It was the cold that settled in the hearts of a community that had already seen too much. On a quiet residential street, less than a mile from the sacred ground where George Floyd's life was stolen, another life was extinguished. Another name was added to a list that should not exist. This was not a battlefield. This was not a war zone. This was a neighborhood, and a government agent, sworn to uphold the law, became judge, jury, and executioner. The shot was fired by an agent of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE, an agency with a budget of over $40 billion, deployed with the force of an occupying army. The bullet pierced the windshield of a Honda Pilot SUV. It found its mark in a U.S. citizen, a mother who had just dropped her 6-year-old son off at school. Her name was Renee Nicole Macklin Good. She was not the target of any warrant. She was not a threat. She was a woman in a car, on a street, in her own country. Her death was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed for violence, and a political apparatus that sanctions it. The sound of that gunshot echoed far beyond the Minneapolis street where it was fired. It was a sound that reverberated through a nation already fractured by distrust. It was a sound that spoke of a government turning its weapons inward. The agents were there as part of a massive immigration crackdown launched by the Trump administration, an operation that had already left a trail of bodies. But this was different. This was a citizen, a mother, a poet, killed in broad daylight. The story that would be told by federal officials was one of danger and terrorism. But the videos, captured by bystanders, told a different story. They told a story of fear, confusion, and a life taken without cause. This is the story of how an agency of the state became a weapon against its own people. It is the story of how words like terrorism are twisted to justify the unjustifiable. It is the story of a government that shields its agents from accountability and meets public grief with militarized force. The killing of Renee Nicole Macklin Good was more than a tragedy. It was a symptom of a deep and terrifying sickness in the body politic. It forces us to ask a fundamental question. What happens when the government, created to protect the people, becomes the very thing the people need protection from? This question is not new. It is written into the very DNA of the nation. Who was Renee Nicole Macklin Good? The federal government would have you believe she was a domestic terrorist, a dangerous radical who used her car as a weapon. This is the language of dehumanization. It is a necessary first step in justifying state-sanctioned murder. But the truth is far simpler and far more profound. Renee Good was a 37-year-old woman. She was a mother to 3 children. She was a writer, a poet, whose words explored faith and life and love. She was a devoted Christian. She was a U.S. citizen, born and raised. She was not a statistic. She was a human being, with a story, with a future. A future that was stolen from her. She had recently moved to Minneapolis from Kansas City, seeking a new start after the death of her husband, a military veteran, in 2023. She hosted a podcast with him, sharing stories and building community. Those who knew her described a peaceful soul, a person of deep faith and conviction. On the morning of her death, she was simply living her life. She took her youngest child, her 6-year-old son, to school. Her partner was in the passenger seat. She was driving home. That is the sum of her crime. She was driving her car in a neighborhood where federal agents had set up a dragnet. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a country that is increasingly the wrong place for anyone who gets in the way of federal power. The video evidence is damning. It does not show a terrorist. It shows a woman, stopped in her car, surrounded by armed men in tactical gear. For 3 minutes, her SUV is stationary. The agents approach, shouting, their aggression palpable. They yank at her door handle. According to witnesses and her surviving partner, the commands were contradictory. Get out of the car, move the car, stay still. It is a classic tactic of control and confusion. It is designed to create panic. In that panic, Renee Good tried to drive away, to escape the men who were screaming at her. She was not trying to run them over. She was trying to get away. That is when Agent Jonathan Ross stepped directly in front of her car and fired. The official narrative crumbles under the weight of this reality. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara reviewed the evidence and stated plainly, there was no indication that Renee Good was trying to harm anyone, Mayor Jacob Frey was even more blunt, calling the federal self-defense claim bullshit. The person who died that day was not a threat. She was a victim. A poet whose voice was silenced by a bullet paid for by American taxpayers. Her death serves as a chilling testament to the stories a government is willing to tell, and the lives it is willing to sacrifice, to protect its own power and authority. The story of Renee Good is the story of what we lose when that power goes unchecked. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, a familiar pattern emerged. It is the pattern of the blue wall of silence, but amplified to a federal scale. It is a fortress of impunity, constructed with legal jargon and jurisdictional claims. The goal is simple: to protect the agent, to control the narrative, and to block any and all outside scrutiny. The investigation into the killing of Renee Nicole Macklin Good was not a search for truth. It was an exercise in containment. The federal government immediately closed ranks, creating an impenetrable barrier around the incident and the agent who pulled the trigger, Jonathan Ross. Accountability was never on the table. The first move was to assert exclusive jurisdiction. The U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI declared that this was a federal matter, period. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state's primary investigative body for police killings, was told it had no role to play. Think about that. A homicide occurs on a city street in Minnesota, and the state's own law enforcement is barred from investigating. The BCA was denied access to evidence. They were denied access to the scene. They were denied the ability to interview the federal agents involved. The message from Washington was clear. This is our kill, and we will handle it our way. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison called the move deeply concerning. Civil rights litigator Subodh Chandra called it preposterous. This is not normal procedure. This is a power play. It is the federal government declaring itself above the law of the states in which it operates. Agent Jonathan Ross, the man who fired the fatal shots, was placed on administrative leave, a paid vacation. We learned that ICE agents in Minneapolis are not required to wear body cameras. A deliberate policy choice that ensures there is no official video, only the government's word against that of a dead woman. The lack of body cameras is not an oversight. It is a strategy. It preserves the ambiguity that allows the state to craft its own convenient fictions. In the absence of official footage, the government's narrative, no matter how flimsy, can be presented as plausible. This federal fortress is a key component of authoritarianism. When agents of the state can kill with impunity, shielded from local oversight and accountability, they are no longer peace officers. They are soldiers of an occupying force. The legal architecture being built around ICE is designed for exactly this purpose. Vice President J.D. Vance declared that the agent had absolute immunity. This is the language of kings and dictators, not of a democratic republic. It signals a terrifying reality where federal agents are a class apart, unbound by the laws that govern the citizens they are supposed to serve. The wall built around Jonathan Ross was not just to protect one man. It was to protect the entire system that empowered him. Words are weapons. In the hands of the state, they can be as deadly as any bullet. The moment Renee Good was killed, a second assault began. This was an assault on her character, on her memory, and on the truth itself. The Trump administration immediately deployed its most powerful weapon, the language of terrorism. It is a magic word, a term so loaded with fear and anger that it short-circuits critical thought. Say terrorism, and you can justify almost anything. You can justify a shooting through a windshield. You can justify the suspension of due process. You can justify war on your own citizens. This is the playbook of the modern authoritarian. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was one of the first to deploy the script. She did not speak of a tragedy, or a mistake, or a U.S. citizen who had been killed. Instead, she labeled Renee Good's actions domestic terrorism. She claimed Good had stalked and impeded federal officers, that she had attempted to weaponize her vehicle. This narrative was crafted before any real investigation could have taken place. It was a pre-packaged story, designed for cable news and social media. It painted Renee as the aggressor and Agent Ross as the hero, a brave officer whose life was in danger. It was a fiction, but it was a powerful one. Vice President J.D. Vance amplified the lie. He called the incident classic terrorism and blamed Renee Good for her own death. He went a step further, claiming she was incited by radical left ideology. This is a crucial part of the strategy. It is not enough to demonize the victim. You must also demonize her perceived allies. You create a vast conspiracy of enemies of the state. You link the dead woman to a political movement, transforming her from a person into a symbol of a dangerous other. By doing so, you give permission to your supporters to feel no sympathy. Her death becomes a righteous victory in a culture war. The lie becomes the truth. Even President Trump, who reportedly expressed private discomfort after seeing the video, initially called it a vicious situation. The machine of state propaganda is relentless. It repeats the lie until it sinks into the public consciousness. The use of terrorism to describe a panicked woman trying to drive away from armed men is a deliberate and cynical perversion of language. It is the same tactic used by fascist and communist regimes throughout history to justify the liquidation of political opponents. It recasts a police killing as a counter-terrorism operation. It transforms a victim into a villain, and it prepares the public to accept even greater acts of violence in the name of security. The response from Minnesota's state and local officials was one of shock and outrage. They found themselves in an impossible position. A citizen had been killed in their jurisdiction, but they were powerless to investigate. The federal government had drawn a line in the sand, treating Minneapolis not as a partner in a federal system, but as occupied territory. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who had navigated the city through the fires of 2020, did not mince words. He called the federal justification for the shooting bullshit and publicly demanded that ICE leave his city. It was a cri de coeur from a leader watching his authority and the safety of his citizens being systematically dismantled by a higher power. Governor Tim Walz also pushed back, demanding that the state be allowed to participate in the investigation. He understood the stakes. Public trust in law enforcement, already fragile, was shattering. Without a transparent, independent investigation led by state authorities, there could be no hope of a just outcome. The people of Minnesota would never accept a verdict handed down by the very federal agencies implicated in the killing. The governor's plea was not just about jurisdiction, it was about the fundamental legitimacy of the rule of law. But his demands were ignored. The federal government held all the cards, all the evidence, and all the power. The jurisdictional conflict exposed a raw nerve in the American system of federalism. What happens when the federal government acts not as a protector of rights, but as a violator of them? The state of Minnesota, with its own constitution and its own laws, was rendered impotent. The message was chilling. A federal agent can kill a Minnesotan on a Minnesota street, and the state of Minnesota can do nothing about it. This is not a partnership. This is a hierarchy. It is the logic of empire, not of a democratic republic. The federal government's actions created a crisis of sovereignty, turning state and local officials into spectators at a crime scene in their own backyard. In response to the growing unrest, Governor Walz made a difficult choice. He authorized the Minnesota National Guard to be staged and ready. It was a move born of a grim reality. He knew the people's anger was justified. He also knew that the federal government's militarized response to that anger would likely be brutal and indiscriminate. The Guard was positioned not to suppress the people, but ostensibly to protect them from the escalating federal presence. The state was caught in the middle, a buffer zone between its own enraged citizens and an unyielding, aggressive federal force. Minneapolis was a city, and Minnesota a state, under siege from within. The people of Minneapolis did not wait for an investigation. They had seen this before. They knew the script. They knew that justice is not given, it is demanded. In the hours after Renee Good's death, the community responded with the language it had learned through bitter experience. The language of protest. Vigils bloomed at the site of the shooting, with flowers and candles marking the spot where a life was so violently taken. But grief quickly hardened into rage. People poured into the streets, their voices rising in a unified chant. Arrest the shooter. They saw the killing not as an isolated incident, but as an act of war by their own government. The protests were immediate and visceral. They were a direct confrontation with the federal presence in their city. Demonstrators marched to the federal buildings, confronting lines of federal agents. They erected makeshift barricades, reclaiming the streets where Renee was killed. The parallels to the 2020 uprising after the murder of George Floyd were impossible to ignore. The same pain, the same anger, the same demand for accountability. But this time, the target of that anger was not a local police department. It was the full, faceless might of the federal government, embodied by heavily armed agents from ICE and the Border Patrol. The federal response was swift and brutal. There was no attempt at de-escalation. There was no respect for the right to assemble. The protesters were met with force. Federal officers, including the elite BORTAC units, the Border Patrol's equivalent of a SWAT team, were deployed. They came with tear gas, pepper spray, and pepper ball projectiles. The streets of Minneapolis, a major American city, were clouded with chemical agents. The sounds of peaceful chants were replaced by the crack of projectiles and the screams of people choking on gas. This was not policing. This was suppression. It was the state using instruments of pain to silence dissent. This violent crackdown is a hallmark of an authoritarian regime. In a democracy, the people's grief and anger are heard. In an authoritarian state, they are crushed. The government's reaction revealed its true nature. It saw the protesters not as citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, but as an enemy to be subdued. The closure of Minneapolis public schools for the rest of the week was a stark admission of the city's instability. The government had created a situation so volatile that it was no longer safe for children to go to school. The killing of one citizen had led to the militarized occupation of a community and the punishment of anyone who dared to object. This is the price of dissent in Donald Trump's America. The killing of Renee Nicole Macklin. Good does not exist in a vacuum. It is a single, brutal data point in a much larger, more terrifying pattern. It is the culmination of a long train of abuses and usurpations, to borrow a phrase from the nation's founding document. These are not isolated incidents of an agency gone rogue. This is the result of a deliberate transformation of ICE from an immigration agency into a national political police force. With a budget soaring past $40 billion, it operates with the funding and mentality of a military branch deployed on American soil against a perceived internal enemy. Its true purpose is no longer just immigration enforcement. It is the enforcement of a specific political ideology. This transformation has been happening in plain sight. Since the launch of the administration's aggressive new immigration crackdown in 2025, a clear pattern of violence has emerged. At least 9 immigration enforcement-related shootings have occurred since September 2025, all involving individuals in vehicles. Renee Good's death is at least the 5th fatality resulting from these operations. The excuse is always the same. The agent feared for their life. The vehicle was a weapon. It is a script that has been used to justify shooting after shooting. It is a license to kill anyone who tries to flee, turning a traffic stop or a warrant service into a potential death sentence. The very structure and mission of ICE have been warped to serve an authoritarian agenda. The deployment of 2,000 federal officers to Minnesota was not about immigration numbers. It was a show of force. It was about demonstrating the power of the central government to impose its will on states and cities that dissent. ICE and its sister agency Customs and Border Protection have become the president's personal army. They are deployed to cities to quell protests, to intimidate political opponents, and to enforce a brutal vision of order. They operate with less oversight and fewer restrictions than almost any other law enforcement agency in the country. They are, in effect, a paramilitary wing of the executive branch. This is the long train of abuses. It is the steady erosion of rights. It is the militarization of domestic law enforcement. It is the demonization of immigrants and political opponents. It is the creation of a legal framework of immunity that places federal agents above the law. It is the use of state violence to crush dissent. It is the transformation of a government agency into a tool of white supremacist authoritarianism, serving the whims of one man. The shooting of Renee Good was not an aberration. It was the system working as intended. It was the inevitable result of a government that has declared war on a segment of its own people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are not just words on an old piece of parchment. They are the moral foundation of the American experiment. They are the promise. The Declaration of Independence goes on to state the consequence of breaking that promise. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The power flows from us, the people, to the government, not the other way around. The next sentence is the most radical, the most dangerous, and the most important in American history. that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. This is the emergency brake. This is the clause that makes the people the ultimate authority. The founders understood that governments could become tyrannical. They knew that the state, entrusted with power to protect rights, could use that same power to destroy them. The killing of Renee Nicole Macklin. Good is a direct assault on the most fundamental of these rights, the right to life. When a government agent can kill an unarmed citizen in the street with impunity, that government has become destructive of its ends. When it systematically blocks accountability, it has broken its covenant with the people. When it militarizes its response to public grief, it has forsaken its duty to protect liberty. When it creates a climate of fear where a mother can be killed on her way home from her child's school, it has obliterated the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence is not a historical document. It is a living argument. And the events in Minneapolis make that argument terrifyingly relevant. The founders did not take this lightly. They spoke of a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object. They argued that such a history evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. They concluded that in such a case it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government. The shooting of Renee Good, the federal cover-up, the violent crackdown on protesters, the history of ICE's escalating violence. Does this not evince a design? Is this not a long train of abuses? The preamble to the Declaration is not just a philosophical statement. It is a diagnosis, and it is a call to action. It tells us that direct resistance is not only a right, but a duty when the state itself becomes the primary threat to our lives. We stand at a precipice. The events in Minneapolis are not just a news story that will fade in a week. They are a flashpoint. They are a moment of terrible clarity, revealing the chasm between the promise of American democracy and its brutal reality in 2026. The killing of Renee Nicole Macklin Good, a U.S. citizen, by a federal agent who is now shielded by the full power of the state, forces every one of us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What does it mean to be a patriot? What does it mean to defend democracy? And what do you do when your government wages war on its own people? To ignore this question is to be complicit. To look away is to consent. The machinery of authoritarianism relies on the silence and inaction of the majority. It feeds on the belief that it can't happen here, even as it is happening right in front of us. It relies on our willingness to accept the official story, to believe the lies about terrorism, and to see the victims of state violence as somehow deserving of their fate. It counts on us to value a false sense of order over the messy, chaotic, and essential work of demanding justice. The federal response in Minneapolis, lies, cover-ups, and violence, is a test. It is a test to see what they can get away with. We are told to trust the process. But what process is there when the state investigates itself? We are told to remain peaceful. But what does peace mean when it is enforced by tear gas and pepper balls? We are told to vote. But what does voting mean when the levers of state power are used to kill citizens between elections? The traditional tools of democratic change feel inadequate in the face of a government that refuses to be bound by law or morality. The protesters in Minneapolis, chanting in the face of armed federal agents, are grappling with this question in real time. They are asking if the old rules still apply. This is the question of our time. It is the question that defines this generation. When the government itself becomes the source of a long train of abuses, when it destroys life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what is the duty of the citizen? Is it to remain silent, to hope for the best, to wait for the next election? Or is it to embrace the radical idea at the heart of the American founding, that the people are the ultimate sovereign, and that they have not only the right, but the duty, to resist a government that has become a tyranny? The shot that killed Renee Good echoes through the soul of the nation, and how we answer its challenge will determine if the republic lives or dies.